Hello and good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking dinner time to join us. My name is Mariam Pira. I'm the local wheel coordinator for the group here in Chicago. I'm joined by colleagues from Common Wheel Magazine and our friends at the Bernadine Center. Thank you so much for joining us. We love seeing so many faces. So before we get started for the evening, just a couple of housekeeping rules as folks are coming in from the chat, from the waiting room. First of all, your mics will be muted during the program. This is just our way of making sure that there isn't feedback or background noise while the program itself is going on. So thank you for allowing us to put together as streamlined a program as possible. Second piece is we do want you engaging. We love hearing from you. So please feel free to use the chat, ask questions, make comments, post links to resources or books or quotes or prayer, whatever you think might be of interest or relevance. We're happy to see them. And then at the end of the program, when we get to the Q&A, we will ask you if you're able to put your video on, because it's just nicer to be able to engage as close to face as we can accomplish in 2021. And just so you all know, when we get to the Q&A part of the program, that will not be recorded, but we'll have more instructions when we get there. Okay. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists for tonight's event, sort of a reunion from a year ago. So first up, we have John Gehring, who's a Catholic Program Director at Faith in Public Life and author of The Francis Effect, A Radical Pope's Challenge to the American Catholic Church. A writer, journalist, and advocate, John has been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Religion News Service, and the National Catholic Reporter. He won a 2019 Religion News Association Award for his commentary writing in Common Wheel magazine. John is the proud father of a 6-year-old son, Leo, and a 10-year-old daughter, Sophie. He lives in Washington, D.C. Hi, John. Our next speaker is Adrienne Alexander. She's worked at AFSCME Council 31, a public sector union in Illinois, since 2010. And she currently serves as Director of Intergovernmental Affairs. In that capacity, she does lobbying, budget and policy analysis, and politics. For fun, she reads and tweets a lot about politics beyond Illinois, including church politics. She's been enjoying quarantine with her husband and 2 daughters. They virtually attend St. Benedict the African in Inglewood. Next is sort of our newcomer to our gang for tonight's event. We have David, who's the lay ecclesial minister in the Archdiocese of Chicago, and he's served for 21 years. He holds a Master of Divinity from Loyola University and currently works at as the Pastoral Associate for St. Andrew Parish in Lakeview, where he focuses on family catechetical models and evangelization. I can't speak tonight, you all. It's been a long day already. And then finally, our last panelist, Raúl Zegarra, holds a BA and MA in philosophy from the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru. He also has a Master in Theological Studies from the University of Notre Dame and a PhD in Theology from the University of Chicago. Raúl is the author of 3 books, which were published in Spanish, all devoted to the intersections between philosophy, theology, and politics, Faith and Solidarity with History, Subversive Hope, and 2 theological languages. He's currently working on a 4th book titled The Revolution of Tradition, which studies the contributions of the religious activism of liberation theology to the general struggle for social justice. He has written several book chapters and articles that appeared in scholarly journals in the US and Latin America. He is also a regular op-ed contributor to Peruvian newspapers El Comercio and La República. Previously, Raúl held teaching positions at the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru and the Peruvian University of Applied Sciences. Currently, he teaches at Loyola and DePaul universities here in Chicago. And he is also a Wheel member when we are able to get together in person. So with that, I will turn it over to John to get us started.
Thank you, and appreciate the warm welcome. Good evening, everybody. It's about 60 degrees here in Washington, D.C., where I'm coming from, and there are very few things that would keep me from being outside right now. And this conversation is definitely one of them. So it's good to be with you all this evening. And I want to thank especially the Bernardin Center and the Catholic Theological Union, all the work that Steve Millies and Peter Cunningham have put into this event. And also, it's always great to have a partnership with Commonweal magazine, which I've enjoyed writing for a number of years now. So I want to thank the folks there, Gabriella Wilk and Milton Bravo at Commonweal. And also always appreciate the work of Miriam Pera and Darius Villalobos at the Wheel in Chicago for putting so much work into these conversations. So thanks to you all. So this is a bit of a reunion sort of conversation for many of us who were able to gather last year in Chicago. And, I have to say, thinking about that night, there's a lot of nostalgia for me. I think probably for many of you who were there, and this is true for me, it was sort of the last quote unquote normal gathering that many of us had attended. And it was such a warm and gracious evening. I mean, I remember a jazz band, an open bar, good food, good conversation. And that was even before the panel started. So it just got better from there. So to say we're in a different time and a different era really is a big understatement. When we last came together, if you think about it, Donald Trump was still the president of the United States. White nationalist politics was ascendant in the White House and in our politics. And a deadly pandemic that has now killed more than 500,000 people was raging, and we couldn't have imagined the nightmare that was descending on us. So where do we find ourselves at this moment? We all know Trump has been defeated, but I would argue we're still coming to grips with Trumpism and what white Christian nationalism has done to our culture and politics. I think we all saw that very dramatically with the violent insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, where you had people with Jesus save signs in one hand and a Confederate flag in another hand. So we're grappling with that. But a year later, we also have moments of hope too. We find ourselves with a new administration, only the second Catholic president in U.S. history, and the first woman and first Indian American vice president in U.S. history. We also, in the wake of the George Floyd police killing in Minneapolis, the Black Lives Matter movement has really continued to force all of us to reckon with race and racism and police violence. And that's a backdrop that has been building for a number of years. So with that context, my assignment that I was given tonight is to really briefly reflect back on some of the intersection of Catholicism, the election, and the narrative around faith in the public square from last year. But I think even more importantly, to think a little bit about where we find ourselves today in this very sort of challenging, almost surreal moment that I think is, testing all of us individually, but also testing our political and ecclesial institutions in pretty unprecedented ways. So first, just for the brief look back, Catholicism, as you all know, was really front and center during the election. Probably not since Senator John Kerry in 2004 ran for president have we had as much debate and discussion around Catholicism in public life. And as you may recall, John Kerry also clashed with Catholic bishops because of his views on abortion rights, and we're seeing a bit of a reprise of that today. On the campaign trail, you all saw how Joe Biden kind of wore his ethnic, old school Irish American Catholicism right out there on his sleeve. And that was something new and different. John Kerry did not do that when he ran in 2004. And Biden was never the favorite Democrat among young progressives who really supported Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, but he secured the nomination with Black voters in South Carolina that really turned the tide. And the big push that he needed that was quite different from how Hillary Clinton performed in 2016 was his success with Catholic voters in those key battleground states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And we can get into that a little bit later if people want to. I would argue that despite Trump's sort of weaker performance among white Catholics, the fact that more than half of white Catholics did still vote for Donald Trump, despite the president's sort of very consistent nativism, racism, misogyny, really does require a reckoning with what it means to be a pro-life Catholic and what it means to be a faithful Catholic citizen in our country. I think we still have not come to terms with that. Fast forwarding to Inauguration Day, I think many of us, including myself, were proud to see a Catholic president attend Mass before the inauguration. He attended my parish here in DC, the Cathedral of St. Matthew. We watched Biden quote St. Augustine in his inauguration address. And of course, we were all, I think, in awe, at least I was, I'm sure many of you were, of Amanda Gorman, the young poet Amanda Gorman, a parishioner at St. Bridget Catholic Church in Los Angeles, who I think really reminded us of the sacramental power of language, both to heal and to challenge us at the same time. So simply put, it was a very Catholic day. But even as President Biden was giving his address, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops was sort of pushing back very strongly. I'm sure many of you saw the statement from Archbishop Jose Gomez of Los Angeles, the president of the Bishops' Conference, really challenging the president and talking about how the president's support for abortion rights advances moral evils and threatens the human dignity of life. Now, to be clear, I don't expect our church leaders to remain silent when it comes to the new administration's position on abortion. But I do think when you see someone like Archbishop Naumann, who leads the pro-life committee at the Bishops' Conference, basically say that Joe Biden should stop calling himself a Catholic, I really think that's a form of pastoral malpractice that does very little to change hearts and minds on this issue. I would also say, there is an effective way to express sincere disagreement with President Biden on abortion without burning bridges to the White House and without alienating many Catholics who I think are proud that this president has demonstrated that his faith is not only central to his sort of personal identity, but also his policies and his commitment to the common good. I think, Pope Francis has modeled that. Bishops like Cardinal Gregory here in Washington, D.C. have modeled that. One thing I think is really intriguing, and I hope we can get into it in this conversation, is a few weeks ago, many of you may have seen this, that the Wall Street Journal had a really interesting article, and it was written by their Vatican correspondent. And the headline was, "Can Catholic Social Teaching Unite a Divided America?" Now, for those of us who spend too much time on Twitter, and you know who you are, and I'm among that crowd, and for those of us who write about faith and public life and the Catholic Church and politics, I think it's easy to respond to that question with a bit of a deep angsty sigh, to be honest with you. Catholic social teaching is so frequently weaponized in our culture and political wars that it's hard to sometimes be optimistic about it. But having sort of given my own sort of skepticism about the limits of Catholic social teaching, given the political and media echo chambers that we all live in, I do think that there's real power there. I think our teachings offer us a really unique framework, right? If you think about it, Catholic social teaching is not an either or binary tradition, it's a both and tradition. And I think that can be a really helpful tool right now. As Catholics, we talk about rights and responsibilities. We talk about the immigrant child at the border and the unborn life in the womb. We talk about subsidiarity and solidarity, the essential role of government and the importance of local civic institutions. So I think, really our church's commitment to the common good, which is, not an abstract meet in the middle faux unity, but really a powerful and quite radical concept, can really help us at this moment. And what a great time to revive the concept of the common good. We're facing a global pandemic that requires us to work together. Literally, our life and health depend on our recommitment to the common good. I think we've seen how the ideologies of extreme individualism and libertarianism have really been exposed for what they are, which is a form of social Darwinism that has really nothing to do with authentic Christianity. I also think that Catholic social teaching offers us, a bit of a framework to help interrogate unjust social systems. Individuals act unjustly, but institutions do as well. And I think we can draw some wisdom from that. Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti reminds us that if we simply return to the economic and political status quo after this pandemic, we will have really wasted an opportunity to rethink and reimagine our institutions. You know, he calls for a new kind of politics, which is something we could discuss among the panel. I want to end with more of a sort of question or two that I'm grappling with that I don't really have easy answers for, because I admit to struggling with these issues. But, you know, many of us have friends, families, neighbors who voted for Donald Trump. And, you know, they continue, these people that we love, to support a president who really did double down on racism and nativism. And so I think one question that I'm grappling with is, how do we speak truth to power and challenge those who would enable the worst of Trumpism to still flourish, while at the same time having a big enough heart and a capacity to listen and understand those who disagree with us? I don't have the answer to that question, but I think it's an important question for the panel and one that we might grapple with.
Thanks so much, John. Adrienne, would you like to give your provide your comments next?
Thanks, Miriam, and thank you all for having us here today and for those that joined us tonight. I just wanted to talk a little bit about kind of our foundations. And for those of you that heard me speak last year, I started out this way too, but I really do think it's important to go back to faithful citizenship as kind of the foundational document about what it means to engage as Catholics. And as I went back and looked at these issues, I felt they're even more important after nearly a year of the pandemic, after 500,000 people dead, as we're thinking about what it means to be a country that truly grapples with racial justice, not just talks about it, but actually does something about it. When we think about climate change and you know, wreaking havoc and the things that just happened in Texas. So some of the issues that were highlighted in that document that go beyond maybe some of the issues that we hear talked about are healthcare. You know, we're going to have to, even as we come out of the pandemic and return to a more normal life, we are going to be talking about what are the long-term effects of those who contracted COVID. We're talking now about an equitable way to distribute the vaccine. And we have folks that have foregone preventative care for a year. So what does that look like? How do we deal with racism? How do we create a more just society? How do we get adequate benefits and security for those that are older in age? How do we access clean water, equal pay, and employment for women? Sorry, this is pandemic life. And how do we deal with affordable housing? We must be diligent about what's happening at the state and local level. And I think that's another thing that we should be taking from everything that's happened since January 6th, and just looking at how maybe some of the state parties and state and local politicians had enabled the attack on democracy that we had. So after the huge turnout we had after the election, after we had the huge turnout in the election, we've seen some states really try to roll back voting access, and there's a chance to expand Medicaid and healthcare. But some states have really tried to do eviction moratoriums and really address the pandemic, but also governments have been stretched to the max and are waiting for federal funding and trying to do something about that. So I think state government is a place that's a lot happens that really impacts folks' lives, but unfortunately doesn't get the attention that is needed. And you can see that we're even more divided than ever. And that is especially plays out, I think, on the state and local level. So Catholic voters are no different than other folks when it comes to dealing with these issues. But I think we're uniquely equipped to really be able to bring folks together because, as John mentioned, we're not talking about a Republican, it's something that neatly fits into Republican ideals or Democratic ideals. We go beyond that. We're talking about a whole life common good approach based off of solidarity. And so I think that we're uniquely able to work in coalitions at the state and local level, and we should be pushing our Catholic conferences to do so to get things done for the common good. I was going back and looking at my notes from last year, and it stuck out to me that John said that democracy was really fragile. We really couldn't have guessed just how prophetic John was in that moment. So I think that one of the things that's really incumbent on us to do is not just vote in local elections, but also just to be extremely engaged, to be connected to people, to challenge misinformation, and to have those hard conversations. But not only in the political sphere, it's also about what are we doing in our families? What are we doing in the workplace? So I think that it's hard to figure out the way you really want to do that. And obviously, I think that our own parish life is an important way to do it. But that too is challenging in the pandemic era. I know my own parish is still virtual.
Why
but
it's not on Facebook?
But I think that it's important to really engage in the church and in the Catholic conference, in addition to the political sphere. Thank you, and I appreciate everyone's understanding.
Thanks, Adrienne. Thanks, Kari. It's good to see you. So, David, I'm sorry you have the fun task of having to follow up. Kari,
I was just thinking how much I love it, Adrienne, because you know, growing up as a Catholic in my Catholic parish, it was all about family and family being together, and it just makes me seeing everyone's comments and seeing your daughter there. It's just so heartwarming. So thank you, and thank you for everyone being here. Thank you for John and my fellow panelists as we enter in this conversation tonight. My contribution to the conversation tonight, it comes from my experience of working as a minister in a Catholic parish, a lay minister, sometimes in youth ministry, sometimes in catechetical ministry for adults and for children. And I've done that for 20 years. And I've had a variety of experiences. I've worked in parishes where it was inconceivable how you could be Catholic and be a Democrat. And I've also worked in parishes where it was inconceivable how you could be Catholic and be a Republican. So I've had to kind of learn how to exist in this milieu, and I've also had to learn how to affect change within this context, applying the best that I can to either situation. I'm going to note that in my experience tonight, I'm reflecting not on instructions on how to be a good Catholic per se, or how individually we need to take responsibility for our role in the public sphere. I'm going to talk about being a minister in a church. And that's not to say we don't need good Catholics. We need prophets. We need people who are Catholic who run for public office. We need community organizers. We need people to go out and protest and write letters, and we need lobbyists, and we need Catholics to be influencers into our public discourse and dialogue. I'm going to focus on three things in my reflection tonight, which have kind of been my key to, as I said, living in this milieu and ministering in this milieu. First, I'm going to be talking about having a disposition of neutrality and the importance of that. Then I'll be talking about how I, as a minister, can insert stimulus that helps to build consciousness and helps people develop a well-formed conscience as they live out their Catholic identity. And then I'll be talking about my own woundedness and how that plays into being a minister in this environment. So first, the disposition of neutrality. And by this, I want to emphasize, I do not mean being neutral on injustice. We are not neutral about gospel values. We need to be bold and take a stance. But I really love what John said in his opening remarks about the pastoral malpractice that we're seeing in our pastoral leaders. And it led me to reflect that I was influenced very heavily when I was in high school and college by my bishop at the time. My bishop, I grew up in Collinsville, Illinois, outside of St. Louis. And I went to Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. And my bishop had a practice, since I was the only student from his diocese at Catholic U. Whenever there was a bishop's meeting in D.C., he'd come out and he'd hang out with me and we'd do dinner. And it was just great conversations. And he was a contemporary, of course, at the time of Cardinal Bernardin. And he was very likely, appointed or influenced by Cardinal Bernardin to be the Bishop of Springfield, Illinois. And Bishop Ryan taught me how important it was for bishops not to draw a political endpoint, that they lose their influence when they become too directive. And Bishop Ryan lived by that. And of course, I was influenced by that. As I said, we are not neutral on issues of justice, but pastoral leaders need to be strategic and they need to avoid drawing ideological conclusions. The pastoral leader should not assume the role of determining the end point of a political decision. And that's kind of my key point here is we can't be in the role of determining the end point of somebody's political decision because it short circuits the individual's conscience and their ability to seek the truth from the Holy Spirit and act upon it in their own hearts. As pastoral leaders, I think we really need to honor the integrity of the process of the individual as the Holy Spirit works within them. So, just for a thought experiment, we can think about this. You don't want to engage your religious leader with a lot of noise and interference. And that can happen pastorally when the pastor short circuits the process. When you think about it, when you're coming to your child's first communion, or you are getting ready to be married, or even if you're going to the sacrament of reconciliation, if you have in the back of your mind that this pastor or this minister triggers me because of their political views, then we've done something wrong in our pastoral leadership to help people on their journey of being engaged in the social conversation. So my second point in this is for pastoral leaders, we need to understand that we have the dignified role of inserting stimulus into people's lives that builds their conscience. Now, sometimes that happens with things that are out of our control, but sometimes it's things that are within our control. Things that are out of our control are the readings for this particular Sunday, or the very act of the rituals and communion. Those are out of our control, and they can not only provide sanctifying grace to people, but they can also provide that actual grace. But I like to think of those moments that are within our control, the choice of a song that we choose to sing at Mass, or a pastoral letter we write, or religious instruction, a social media post. These are all places that we can insert the important values of Catholic social teaching, particularly the dignity of the human person and a sense of solidarity, the sense that we belong as a family together. All of those are stimulus through which we exercise pastoral judgment and can show our responsibility to encouraging the building of conscience in the Catholic faithful. So I'd like to just expand on this point by two short stories. One is a story from the Bible. I always think of the episode between Abram and Melchizedek when I think of my work as a minister in a church. It may seem odd, Abram and Melchizedek, what does that have to do? It's a small story. Melchizedek only gets mentioned a little bit in the scriptures, and yet he's remembered forever as a priest of Melchizedek. All he did for Abram was he offered a sacrifice of bread and wine, but his ministry was so important at that point in time in Abram's life that he's remembered forever. That's I think something that should be at the forefront of a pastoral minister's mentality, understanding that these episodic moments of our life are what transform individuals with whom we have the privilege of working. A brief anecdote about this, which is my second story on this point. I was once engaged in a conversation with a woman in her 20s in my parish, and she was struggling with what to do about the election. She wanted to vote for the Democrats because they espoused so many of her beliefs, but she needed to vote Republican because the quote, the Catholic Church is a pro-life church, and that means we need to be Republicans, end quote. So in that episode, in that moment of being Melchizedek to her Abram, I reminded her that we are a pro-life church and asked, are we fully demonstrating our pro-life values if the means by which we advocate for life also violate the respect we have for the dignity of women and their autonomy? Like in a flash, she said, oh my gosh, I think I'm a Democrat. Now, keeping the neutrality that I espouse, I did not comment on her conclusion, but reminded her of the enshrined doctrine we have of the church. We adamantly adhere to the tenet that we must follow one's own conscience. I think if we keep a pedagogy that resembles that of Christ, we'll do very well in these situations. Christ asked more questions than he gave answers. Christ never did violence to the integrity of the human person's ability to think for themselves and to act for themselves. Instead, you see questions that he asks, like, what do you want me to do for you? What are you looking for? Who do you say that I am? Who was the neighbor to the robber's victim? Which brings me to my last point. Knowing my own wounds and my own woundedness. If I understand when I am triggered, how I am triggered, and why I am triggered, then I can begin to more clearly navigate the pastoral relationship I have with parishioners. I can better have a pastoral stance of neutrality, and I can insert stimulus that builds conscience. I can ask God to heal my wounds, and from a place of healing, begin to respond to others. It's a window for me into their own lived experience and allows me to be more compassionate and even with someone with whom I disagree. So here's my story about that. I'm going to talk about a parishioner from my last parish, and to keep his name neutral, I'm going to just call him Doug. Doug is a parishioner who generally makes me angry. I really get disturbed by everything I read from him on social media. He writes such vitriolic things, particularly about COVID, that are just hurtful and untrue and harmful. Now, like many of you, I've been affected by COVID. I've lost a cousin to COVID and had many family members who've had the disease. I also fear its impact, and even as my mom has received and my dad have received their first shots of the vaccine, I just am afraid. And I've given up this last year not visiting them and being attentive to them as I wish, and that hurts me. My woundedness gets triggered whenever I read a post from Doug. It reminds me of my loss and my pain. And sometimes I have to make the decision, I just can't read his stuff anymore. And that's okay. But knowing my own pain, I actually read a little bit further into Doug's social media posts. In a very short space amidst a sea of his comments, Doug wrote that during this past year, he lost his mother to COVID. He wasn't allowed in the hospital, and he didn't understand why. And he resents a government which kept him out of being with his mother. He resents health officials who denied him the precious chance of being able to say goodbye to his dying mother, to say that he loved her, to comfort her. In short, Doug is hurting. And by judging Doug on the end point of his political decisions, I miss the human that is behind those decisions. His way of resolving the pain that he's feeling is very different than mine, but his story serves as a framework for me in viewing the points that I've made thus far in my contribution tonight. For the pastoral minister, neutrality is important. We offer stimulus that guides people on a journey to be more informed about having a conscience with which they can act. But we need to be very careful not to project our own pain. We don't want to transfer our pain, but rather to transform it. And through the transformation of our wounds, we can identify with others' pains and accompany them in their own transformation. That's what I wish to contribute tonight. And I thank you for the time to do that.
Thank you, David. That was incredibly thought-provoking. I appreciate that. Okay, Raúl, you are next on our docket.
Thank you. We have over 300 people. This never happens in academic conferences. It's amazing. Thank you all for coming and for organizing, Steve, Peter, and all of you. So let me quickly move to my brief presentation. I have given it the title, The Marginal Becomes Mainstream. But for this to make sense, let me quickly return to some of the points I made last year in our first gathering. Last year, prompted by John Mayer's monumental series on the historical Jesus, a marginal Jew, I wonder if there is such a thing as a marginal Catholic. I suggested that a good way to address this issue was paying attention to the election results, then the 2018 midterms, in order to reconsider if we can even talk about something like the Catholic vote. My conclusion, based on the data gathered by Pew Research, was that such label was misleading. Catholics do not vote as a bloc. Further, Catholics do not seem to vote based on Catholic official teachings in any decisive way. This was clear in 2018, but preliminary data gathered by Gallup from the 2020 general election does not seem to point in a different direction. Catholics are divided along party lines on some Catholic issues: abortion, assistance to the poor, immigration, etc. However, there is one area that seems somewhat surprising: same-sex marriage. A majority of Catholic Republicans, 59%, support it. Catholic Democrats favor it for an even larger margin, 76%. This suggests that Catholics are making choices with great individual agency and autonomy. Often, this keeps Catholics divided by party lines. However, on same-sex marriage, there seems to be ample consensus among conservative and progressive Catholics. The great majority disagrees with the teachings of the Church in this area. What is this telling us about Catholicism today? Here's where I want to return to the idea of a marginal Catholic. I would argue that this suggests that many Catholics have chosen to be at the margins of the official teaching of the Church, following their own conscience instead. When the Catholics make some of their everyday choices, among which the political decisions are our concern tonight, they seem to claim their autonomy before claiming their Catholic identity. In other words, a significant number of Catholics appear to be fine living on the margins of Catholicism. Many of them, especially but not only progressive Catholics, appear to be marginal Catholics, deviant, dissident, certainly not mainstream. But arguably, this just changed a lot, in fact. Joe Biden is now president of the United States, only the second Catholic, but actually the first for whom the Catholic faith appears to have significant bearing. Now, this is relevant because with Biden, a certain kind of Catholicism, what I have been calling marginal Catholicism, has taken central stage. In a way, it has become mainstream. Biden's is what some commentators and scholars call liberal Catholicism, or the Catholic left. What is especially relevant about liberal Catholicism, or more generally, the religious left? In a nutshell, that it reaches liberal conclusions from religious premises. Put differently, this means that liberal Catholics often support principles like social welfare, racial justice, reproductive rights, and gender equality, among others, based on theological reasoning that comes from the Catholic tradition. Of course, this is not new. The reason why this matters now is because we will see for the first time the highest ranking elected official in the US practicing in some way or another this kind of reasoning in his policy choices. We will see a person who claims for himself the Catholic identity advocating in the most public possible way for policies that may challenge official teachings of the church in one way or another. This is why I argue that the marginal has become mainstream. Paying attention to the theological reasoning of progressive Catholicism, therefore, could be essential for the renewal of this faith tradition. But it's not only a matter of good advertisement for progressive Catholics. I would like to argue that this is good and healthy for American democracy. In his excellent book, The Religious Left and Church-State Relations, constitutional scholar Stephen Schriffen makes the same point, that despite what some portions of the secular left would like to see, the democratic process is permanently shaped by religious commitments and religious reasoning. Millions, literally, vote their faith, think about their voting decisions through theological reasoning, and so on. Yet, despite the fairly similar size of their constituencies, religious reasoning in the public sphere seems to be co-opted by the religious right, whereas the religious left appears to be more quiet. And this may give the impression to many, wrongly so I would argue, that the only way to be religious, particularly Christian, is to be conservative and Republican-leaning. But of course, this is not the case and doesn't have to be the case. The election of Biden, or for that matter of Senator Raphael Warnock, brings to the fore an alternative type of religious affiliation and practice. Further, their election makes the case for many religious people who feel marginalized due to their progressive politics. They are saying to them, you can be Christian and progressive, full stop. Now, none of this suggests that there is anything inherently wrong with the religious right or Christian or Catholic conservatives. Not at all. It is equally healthy for democracy to listen to the voices of, and the arguments of those who oppose abortion, gay marriage, and the like for religious reasons. But the advantage of having people like Biden or Warnock in such public positions of power is that they remind us that other options are possible. Moreover, they remind us with their democratic conservative counterparts that the democratic process precisely should be where we draw the line, which in turn means that both forces must oppose as strongly as possible Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism in all its forms. The advantage of the religious left that Biden and Warnock represent is that it can establish alliances with the secular left to advance the cause of social justice without denying the importance of faith in public life, something not uncommon among secular progressives. Let me conclude with this. In a time of emerging new forms of racism and white supremacy, reckoning with long-standing abuses against women and children, a global pandemic that has aggravated our already existing deep inequalities, and lastly, a time in which democracy itself was under assault, religious leaders have a great responsibility in the common will. They can stand on the side of those fighting for justice and democracy, or they can remain silent. The context is ripe. The marginal has become mainstream. What will they choose? Thank you.
Thank you, Raúl. Thank you to all of our panelists. We're going to be moving shortly into Q&A. Thank you, everybody.